Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today we're diving into something that I know you guys are interested in. Based on the stuff you sent in, we're going to be looking at severance pay in Malaysia.
Oh, yeah, definitely a hot topic.
Yeah, for sure. So we've got some great listener questions, as always, and I'm joined by our expert, as always, to really get to the bottom of this.
Always happy to be here.
All right, so let's jump right in. We've got an interesting article here all about the ins and outs of severance pay in Malaysia. But we also got a question about employer of record services in Malaysia, and specifically INS Global.
Yeah, INS Global is doing some really interesting stuff over there.
For sure. And it seems particularly relevant here, given how complex the employment laws are in Malaysia. So maybe we can start with that question from the listener. What exactly is an EOR, and how could it be helpful for a company that's thinking about expanding into Malaysia?
Right. So an EOR is basically your partner in crime when it comes to employing people in a foreign country.
Okay, so kind of like a guide through the legal maze.
Exactly. They become the legal employer of record for your employees in Malaysia in this case.
So what does that actually look like in practice? Like, what kinds of things would INS Global be handling for a company?
Well, they'd handle all the nitty-gritty HR stuff, payroll, contracts, making sure you're compliant with all the local laws, things that can be a real headache if you're trying to do it all yourself from a distance.
So it's almost like outsourcing that whole HR function to a local expert.
Precisely. And that can be a huge relief, especially when it comes to tricky things like severance pay, which, as we know, can be a minefield.
Yeah, for sure. And that brings us nicely to the article you mentioned earlier, which really digs into the whole severance pay landscape in Malaysia.
Yeah.
And one of the first things that jumped out at me was this distinction between EA employees and non-EA employees.
Right, that's a key distinction in Malaysian labor law.
So can you just remind us who falls under that EA umbrella?
Sure. So the EA refers to the Employment Act of 1955, and it basically covers employees who earn below a certain monthly wage. Currently, it's RM 2000.
Okay, so kind of like a baseline protection for lower wage workers.
Exactly. And it also covers certain types of work, like manual labor, regardless of income.
So for those EA employees, the Employment Act lays out all the rules for things like severance pay, right?
Yes, it's very prescriptive. It sets out the minimum notice periods, how severance is calculated, the whole 9 yards.
And I'm guessing for those non-EA employees, things are a bit more, well,
fluid, shall we say.
Exactly. So their severance entitlements would be determined by their individual contracts.
Precisely, which means having a rock-solid contract is absolutely essential.
Makes sense. So it seems like for companies operating in Malaysia, having someone like INS Global on your side could be really valuable, whether you're dealing with EA or non-EA employees.
Absolutely. They can help you navigate all the nuances of the law, make sure you're treating everyone fairly, and avoid any potential pitfalls.
Okay, so we've got a handle on who's covered by the EA and who's not. But let's talk about some of those specifics, like how is severance pay actually calculated in Malaysia?
Well, for EA employees, it's actually quite straightforward. There's a formula based on their years of service.
Okay, so the longer you've been with the company, the more severance you're entitled to.
Exactly. So, for example, an EA employee with less than 2 years of service would get 10 days of compensation for each year they worked.
Okay, 10 days per year.
That's right. And then it jumps to 15 days per year for those who've been with the company for 2 to 5 years.
Got it. And what about those who've been there even longer?
For 5 years or more, it's 20 days of compensation for each year of service.
Wow, so loyalty really pays off in that sense.
It certainly does. And this is where things can get tricky for those non-EK employees because there's no statutory minimum like that.
Right. So it all comes down to what's in their contract.
Precisely, which is why having a clear and comprehensive contract from the get-go is so crucial.
Especially when you consider that probation periods in Malaysia can actually be extended up to 3 months.
Oh, yeah, that's a unique wrinkle that can really catch people off guard.
So you could potentially be on probation for 6 months, which is a long time to be in limbo.
Absolutely. And if you're let go during that extended probation period, the rules around severance can get really murky.
Yeah, that's why having that legal expertise on hand can be a lifesaver.
No doubt about it, especially when you're dealing with something as sensitive as someone's livelihood.
Well, it's definitely clear that navigating severance pay in Malaysia is no walk in the park.
No, it's a complex landscape with a lot of moving parts.
And we haven't even touched on the tax implications yet.
Oh, that's a whole other can of worms.
Well, I guess we'll have to save that for part 2. But just to recap, we've talked about the allure of Malaysia as an expansion destination.
Right. It's a hotbed of activity right now.
We've untangled the difference between EA and non-EA employees, and we've started to get a grip on how severance pay is calculated.
And we've highlighted the importance of clear contracts and expert guidance.
Absolutely. But the story doesn't end there. So stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dive into the fascinating world of Malaysian tax law and how it all plays into severance pay.
I'm ready when you are.
Okay, so we're back and ready to tackle the tax side of things.
The fun part.
Well, that's one way to put it. I know we were both kind of surprised to see how this all plays out in Malaysia.
Yeah, the Malaysian tax system definitely has its own quirks, shall we say.
For sure. So let's break it down. What makes it so unique when it comes to severance pay?
Well, it all comes down to the Income Tax Act of 1967. Now, normally you'd expect any income you receive to be taxed, right? That's pretty standard. But Malaysia has some specific exemptions in place for certain payments related to, well, loss of employment.
Okay, so you're telling me there are situations where severance pay might not be taxed.
You got it. There are actually several scenarios where that could happen.
All right, now we're talking, give me the details. Which payments qualify for this special treatment?
Well, one key situation is when severance pay is seen as compensation for early termination.
Early termination, meaning?
Meaning the employee could have kept working until retirement, but their employment was cut short.
So it's like acknowledging they're losing out on potential future income.
Exactly. And in that case, the severance pay might be fully or partially exempt from tax.
Interesting. So it's not just about the years of service, but also the reason for leaving.
Right. The circumstances matter a lot. For example, if an employee is forced to retire due to illness and they receive a severance payment, that whole amount is fully tax deductible.
Oh, wow. So there's no tax burden on top of what's probably already a difficult situation.
Exactly. And it's the same for those lump sum retirement gratuities that some companies offer.
You mean like a reward for long service?
Yeah, if the employee retires at or after the age of 55 and receives one of those gratuities, it's completely tax-free.
That's pretty generous.
It is like a nice little thank you from the taxman for all those years of hard work.
So we've got illness-related severance and retirement gratuities. Any other scenarios where someone might get a full tax exemption?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head, but even if someone doesn't qualify for a full exemption, they might still be eligible for partial tax relief.
Oh, okay, so there's still some wiggle room there. How's that work?
Well, the Malaysian system offers relief of RM 10,000 for each consecutive year of service with the same employer.
Wait, so that's like over 2,000 US dollars per year?
That's right. So even if you don't get the whole severance payment exempt, you can still shield a significant chunk of it from taxes.
Wow, that's really interesting. It seems like Malaysia has a pretty unique approach to this whole thing.
They do. They seem to recognize the challenges that employees face when they lose their jobs, and they try to provide some financial relief through the tax system.
It's definitely a more nuanced approach than I was expecting.
Yeah, it's not just a black and white situation. There are a lot of factors that come into play.
And I bet keeping track of all these exemptions and reliefs can be a real headache for companies.
Oh, absolutely. Especially if you're not familiar with the Malaysian tax system.
Which is why having a partner like INS Global can be so valuable.
Exactly. They can handle all the payroll calculations, make sure all the right exemptions are applied, and ensure that you're fully compliant with the law.
So it's not just about saving money on taxes. It's about having that peace of mind, knowing that everything is being handled correctly.
Precisely. And that can be a huge weight off your shoulders, especially if you're a company that's new to operating in Malaysia.
So we've covered the legal framework,
Mm-hmm.
the calculations, and now the tax implications. It's amazing how much depth there is to this topic.
We've only just scratched the surface.
I know, right? There's so much more to explore, especially when you start thinking about the cultural context.
Absolutely. How do cultural norms and societal values shape the way severance is handled in different countries? That's a fascinating question.
And one that we might need a whole other deep dive to unpack.
I'm game if you are.
But for now, let's shift gears and consider some of the broader implications of severance pay beyond just Malaysia.
Sounds good to me.
You know, it's really interesting to see how something like severance pay, which seems like, a pretty standard HR thing, can actually be so complex.
Yeah, there are so many layers to it.
Exactly. And I think our deep dive into the Malaysian system has really highlighted that.
It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Right. And I think beyond just the legal and financial aspects, there's this whole other dimension of, ethics and fairness.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that severance pay isn't just a transaction. It's about treating people with respect and dignity, even during difficult transitions.
And that's something that companies need to be mindful of no matter where they're operating.
For sure. So as we wrap up our deep dive into severance pay in Malaysia, what are some of the key takeaways you'd want our listeners to remember?
That's a good question.
Mm.
Well, I think the first thing is just to understand the importance of having that local expertise.
Couldn't agree more, especially when you're dealing with a system as nuanced as Malaysia's.
Right. And for companies that are thinking about expanding into Malaysia, partnering with someone like INS Global can really make a difference.
Oh, absolutely. They can help you navigate all the complexities of the law and ensure that you're doing everything by the book.
And that peace of mind is invaluable, especially when you're dealing with something as sensitive as people's livelihoods.
Precisely, it's about protecting both the company and the employees.
And I think another key takeaway is just to be aware of the cultural context.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the legal framework, but it's important to remember that cultural norms and societal values can also play a big role in how severance is handled.
And that's something that companies need to be sensitive to.
It's all about building trust and understanding.
I keep coming back to that question you raised earlier about how cultural norms influence severance practices in different countries.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating area to explore.
Like you mentioned, Malaysia's emphasis on community and harmony.
Hmm.
I wonder how that might shape their approach to severance.
Does it lead to more generous severance packages or perhaps a greater focus on outplacement services?
It really makes you think. And I think it highlights the importance of doing your research and understanding the local context before you expand your business internationally.
Absolutely. A little cultural awareness goes a long way.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into the world of severance pay in Malaysia. A huge thank you to our expert for sharing your expertise.
It's been a pleasure.
And of course, a big thank you to you, our listeners, for joining us on this journey. If you have any questions about severance pay in Malaysia or any other global expansion topic, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're always here to help. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.